A little girl vanished without a trace into the silent woods, and while the world rushed on, unaware, only a lone veteran and his aging dog could sense the cry for help carried on the wind. In a place where desperate voices are often swallowed by time and cold earth, fate began to weave a story no one could have foreseen. If you believe that true courage needs no applause, that a life can be saved by simply listening at the right moment, stay with us. Like, subscribe, and let this story take you to a place where hearts, even in silence, still know how to find each other. The morning sun rose soft and golden over the sleepy woods of northern Oregon, filtering through layers of pine and cottonwood trees. It was early June, and Wild Creek Lake shimmered beneath the mist like glass, still untouched by the footsteps of weekend campers who had only just begun to stir. A thin breeze carried the smell of wet bark and distant campfire smoke, rustling through the tents and parked RVs that dotted the lakeside trail. The Green family had arrived the day before, seeking a weekend away from the static of city life in Portland. The father, David Green, a civil engineer with a quiet disposition and a receding hairline, had grown up camping with his own father and wanted to pass on the tradition. His wife, Marissa, a high-energy woman in her late 30s with sun-streaked hair and an instinct for overpacking, had brought everything from citronella candles to battery-operated fans. And then there was Sophie, 7 years old, wide-eyed and freckled, with tangled chestnut hair and the kind of delicate restlessness that made her appear constantly on the edge of flight. She was a child of daydreams, one who spoke softly to insects, hummed while sketching birds in the dirt, and could spend hours tracing the paths of ants through blades of grass. That morning, while her parents unpacked breakfast supplies and argued gently over the coffee pot, Sophie wandered toward the cattail border that separated their campsite from the wilder edge of the lake. Her brother, Ben, 11 and full of disinterest, had stayed inside the tent with his video game. Sophie, feeling unseen as usual, followed the flicker of something blue, perhaps a dragonfly, or maybe just the idea of one. Her small boots pressed into moss and soft earth as she stepped beyond the trail, drawn by the glint of wings and the curious bend of reeds that whispered her name in green. The further she walked, the quieter the world became. The sound of her parents faded, replaced by the gentle squelch of marsh underfoot and the soft chime of distant birdsong. Her heart fluttered with a kind of nervous wonder. Then, in a moment as sudden as a held breath, Sophie's left foot slipped into something cold and dense. She gasped, jerking her leg up, but the mud clung tight. She tried to pull away, only to find her other foot now sinking as well. It was not just wet ground, it was the kind of mud that took its time, that pulled with weighty patience. Panic bloomed in her chest. She called out once, "Mom." But it came out thin and muffled by trees. The reeds around her swayed but did not answer. The dragonfly was gone. Help, she tried again, but the sound dropped like a pebble in water. Within seconds, the mud had swallowed her ankles. She stretched her arms out to the sides, trying to balance, but one knee buckled and she slid deeper. The surface broke in soft gulps as if the earth were sipping her down. Her breath quickened, her eyes stung. Sophie screamed this time, a high, sharp cry that tore the stillness, and vanished. She was too far, and the wind was too clever. But in a small weathered cabin less than a mile east, perched between cedar roots and facing away from the lake, a pair of ears twitched. The cabin belonged to Eli Morgan, a man whose presence was as rough and weathered as the structure he lived in. 60 years old and built like a retired oak, broad-shouldered, sun-beaten, and silent, Eli had once been a search and rescue sergeant in the mountains of Idaho. That was before the drowning of his daughter, Claire, a decade earlier. Since then, Eli had chosen quiet exile over conversation. He rarely went into town, avoided phones, and spoke mostly to the only soul who remained by his side, Ranger, his 12-year-old German Shepherd, a dog who had once been a K9 search partner and now bore a gray muzzle and an old limp on cold mornings. Ranger had a scar across his right ear, a remnant from years past, and eyes that seemed to carry memory better than most people. Where Eli had grown quiet, Ranger had grown watchful. That morning, Eli was boiling water for oatmeal and cutting an apple with the precision of routine when Ranger, who had been curled by the door, stood abruptly. His ears rose. He sniffed once, then twice, and let out a low, guttural bark. Eli glanced up, knife pausing mid-slice. "What is it?" he asked, though Ranger had never needed the words. The dog stepped toward the door, barking again, sharper now, insistent. Eli's brows furrowed. He opened the screen and stepped out onto the porch. The forest smelled the same, mossy, damp. But Ranger was already off the steps, nose to the air, eyes locked in a singular direction, toward the marshes. "Wait," Eli muttered, setting the apple aside. He reached back inside, grabbed his coat and the canvas rope he always kept near the door, just in case, though the cases had grown fewer with the years. He followed Ranger, not quickly, but with a knowing heaviness in his gait. The way the dog moved, urgent but focused, told him something was wrong. Something was calling. They moved through underbrush and along a trail half claimed by vines. It was a path Eli hadn't walked in months. The sky, still soft, grew a shade dimmer beneath tree cover. Birds scattered. The air changed. And then he heard it. Barely. A cry. Thin. Wet. Dying in the reeds. Eli broke into a stride. Ranger was already ahead, darting left through a split in the grass. Eli followed, and there, beyond a patch of flattened cattails, he saw her. A small figure, chest deep now in mud, trembling, arms barely above waterline. Her hair was plastered to her face. Her mouth opened in a scream too tired to climb. "Hold on!" Eli shouted, for the first time in a long time using his voice with force. The girl turned her head, eyes wide with something deeper than fear, something like surrender. Ranger barked beside her, circling the edge of the mud but not stepping in. Smart, Eli thought. Always was. He scanned the perimeter. There was a solid patch of earth nearby, and a low-hanging branch overhead. He tied one end of the rope to his waist, the other to the branch, tested the weight, then lowered himself cautiously to the girl's reach. "Don't move," he said evenly. "It makes it worse." Sophie nodded, barely. "I'm coming to you. I've got you." And he meant it. Eli gripped the rope tighter, easing himself toward the edge of the marsh, where the reeds bowed low and the soil had the slick, deceptive sheen of danger. Each step was measured, a negotiation with the ground beneath him. He knew better than most how quickly solid earth could turn treacherous. Just ahead, Sophie was still half submerged, her arms trembling, her lips quivering as she tried not to sob. The muck clung to her like it had chosen her, as if it meant to keep her. "Look at me, not the mud," Eli said in a calm, low voice, the kind of tone meant to cut through panic without feeding it. "I've got you, kiddo." Sophie's eyes flicked up to meet his. They were the same pale hazel as Claire's had been, years ago, only smaller, more startled, framed by lashes heavy with grit. She didn't speak, but her hands inched toward him, her fingers stretching like small roots reaching for light. Ranger paced the dry edge in a tight circle, low to the ground, tail rigid but still. Every so often, he let out a low whine, as if urging Eli forward. The dog was drenched in sweat and swamp dust, his coat darkened with age but still strong, broad across the shoulders and keen-eyed despite his years. He was the kind of dog who didn't just obey commands, he anticipated them. Eli reached Sophie, wrapping the rope around her middle gently, his movements slow and deliberate. "Hold your breath, sweetheart," he muttered. "We're gonna move together." She nodded, barely. He pulled back just enough to shift her center of gravity, not too fast, he knew better. Quicksand didn't like force. It liked patience. Ranger, sensing the signal, braced his front legs and began to backpedal, teeth clamped down on the rope's end. The weight began to shift. Slowly, agonizingly, Sophie began to rise. The sucking sound of mud releasing its prey was quiet but violent, like the earth giving up a secret. Her legs came free last, black with muck, and Eli lifted her into his arms, staggering backward towards solid ground. They collapsed together beside Ranger, both heaving, hearts pounding. Sophie trembled like a leaf, but she was alive. Eli sat beside her, panting, his shirt soaked with sweat and mud. He didn't speak right away, he knew better than to interrupt the aftermath of fear. Ranger sat beside them like a sentinel, his breath steady, his eyes scanning the tree line. The air buzzed with dragonflies, oblivious to what had just passed. Minutes crawled by before Sophie spoke. "My shoe's gone," she said hoarsely, almost a whisper. Eli chuckled, not unkindly. "We'll call it even." She blinked at him, confused. Even for what? He looked away, his eyes catching the glint of sun off the water beyond the trees. "For something I couldn't do a long time ago." Sophie didn't understand, not yet. But her small hand reached out and touched Ranger's fur. The dog leaned into it, just a little. Eli stood, brushing mud from his jeans. "Let's get you cleaned up," he said. "There's a place not far." He scooped her up gently, and she didn't resist. Ranger led the way back, tail low but wagging slowly, like a metronome guiding them through a forest that felt deeper now than when they had first entered it. The cabin sat like a forgotten thought tucked between two cedars, its wooden siding gray from age and weather, the porch sagging at one corner. Moss had claimed the roof. Wind chimes made from old bullets and keys hung on one beam, tinkling softly in the breeze. Inside, it smelled of pine soap and old canvas, and the fireplace held the faint memory of ash. Eli set Sophie down on the worn couch, then brought out a blanket, a towel, and a pot of water heated on the wood stove. He spoke little, working with practiced gentleness, wiping away the worst of the mud from her arms, legs, and tangled hair. Sophie winced but didn't complain. She had the wide-eyed silence of a child trying to process the size of her own fear. As she rested, Eli moved to the kitchen and began preparing something warm. The kitchen was small but neat, full of jars labeled in blocky handwriting, peppermint leaves, instant oats, dried apples. He filled 2 mugs with weak tea and set one in front of her. She didn't touch it at first, just stared. "Where are my parents?" she asked quietly. Eli hesitated. "I don't know yet. But I imagine they're out there looking for you. My mom was yelling. But then. I think I went too far." Sophie looked down, fiddling with the frayed edge of the blanket. "You did nothing wrong," Eli said, kneeling in front of her. "Kids wander. Parents worry. That's how it works." She tilted her head. "Do you have kids?" The question landed like a pebble in his chest. He looked away. "I had a daughter once. Claire. She'd be older than you now." "What happened?" He didn't speak for a while. "The water took her. And I wasn't fast enough." Sophie nodded slowly, as if accepting something she couldn't yet understand but could still feel. "Is that why you live out here?" "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe because the world got too loud." She sipped the tea. It was too bitter, but she didn't say so. Instead, she reached for the notebook sitting on the edge of the table and pulled it into her lap. It was old, leather-bound, the edges worn from years of use. Inside were sketches of trees, birds, maps of trails, and occasionally, faces. Eli hadn't drawn in weeks. But now Sophie began to draw with a pen she pulled from her jacket pocket. "What are you making?" he asked gently. She turned the page to show him, a rough but unmistakable sketch of him standing beside Ranger, and a small girl covered in mud. Above them was a shaky sun, smiling. "You," she said. Eli felt something loosen in his chest, something that had rusted long ago. Ranger, curled near the fire, let out a low sigh. A knock on the door made them both jump. Eli stiffened, rising quietly. Ranger was already at the door, ears perked. Eli peeked through the curtain. It was Sarah Myers, the local postal worker who doubled as the town's seasonal park warden. She was in her mid-40s, tall and thin with cropped silver-streaked hair and a weathered uniform that hung loose on her frame. Known in town for her dry wit and no-nonsense tone, Sarah had been widowed young. Her husband, a smoke jumper, had died in a fire years ago. Since then, she had found solace in order, routine, and watching over the land. "Eli," she called out. "You home?" He opened the door slowly. "Yeah." Her gaze fell on Sophie behind him, wrapped in a blanket. Her expression softened. "Oh, thank God," she murmured. "We've been looking for her all afternoon. Parents are still out at the lake, frantic." Eli stepped aside. "She's safe now. Found her near the West Marsh." Sarah nodded and stepped inside carefully. She looked at Sophie, kneeling. "Hey there, sweetheart. I'm Sarah. Your mom and dad are gonna be so happy to see you." Sophie clutched her, drawing closer, suddenly unsure. "I'll go get them," Sarah said to Eli. "You stay with her." He nodded, the firelight reflecting off his eyes. As Sarah stepped back out into the dusk, Ranger leaned against Eli's leg, and Sophie quietly reached out a hand to scratch behind his ears. The moment Sophie's chest broke free from the marsh, Eli felt the mud lose its grip, not just on her small body, but on something buried deeper within him. It wasn't just a rescue. It was a resurrection. She slumped into his arms, her breath shallow, her skin cold and pale with streaks of grime across her cheeks. Her once vibrant hair clung to her face in wet clumps, her jacket darkened and sodden. She didn't speak, but her eyes were wide, unfocused, like a child waking from a nightmare she hadn't finished understanding. Eli, his arms trembling with the weight of urgency, hoisted her up and staggered back to firmer ground. Ranger released the rope and rushed forward, tail swishing low, ears pricked, circling them like a sentinel closing ranks. The dog pressed his muzzle gently to Sophie's shoulder, sniffing. A soft whine escaped him, half relief, half worry. "We've got you," Eli whispered, more to himself than her. "You're safe now." He set Sophie down briefly on a patch of dry moss, stripped off his outer shirt and wrapped it around her shaking frame. Then he dug into his coat pocket and pulled out a granola bar. "You need something in your belly." She didn't reach for it, but he broke a piece off and pressed it into her hand. She held it like it was foreign. Behind them, the sun had already begun its descent, casting long shadows through the canopy. The once sweet scent of pine now felt cloying, heavier with the weight of the near tragedy. Eli looked around. The way they'd come was dense, but not impossible to retrace. He could carry her if needed. But not without resting first. He crouched next to her, brushing mud from her forehead. "Can you hear me, sweetheart?" Sophie nodded, slowly. "You're doing great," he murmured. "I'm going to lift you now. We're going to get out of here, okay?" Her small fingers gripped the edge of his shirt, not tightly, but enough to tell him she was still with him. Eli shifted her onto his back, letting her arms drape around his neck. She was light, feather-light, but the weight she carried pressed into his chest. As he stood, Ranger took the lead, his gait measured but determined. They moved carefully through the thickets, retracing broken branches and paw prints. Every so often, Eli paused to adjust her or let her drink from his canteen. She never complained. Once, she coughed softly into his collar. Another time, he thought she said something, "Mom." But it was too faint to be sure. The forest grew dimmer, though not yet dark. The wind stirred the trees with a kind of whispering concern, as if nature itself had watched and now waited. About half an hour in, Ranger stopped abruptly. Eli froze. The dog's body stiffened, nose in the air. Then he let out a single, sharp bark and took off down a narrow deer trail to the left. "Ranger!" Eli hissed, but the dog didn't return. With a muttered curse, Eli adjusted Sophie on his back and followed. The trail was tighter, lined with ferns and low branches, but Ranger barked again, this time more insistently. They emerged suddenly into a small clearing, where a rusted hunting stand leaned awkwardly against a birch tree. At its base sat an old man with a tangled gray beard, in a battered ranger's jacket and camo cap, tending a tiny fire built in a tin coffee can. "'Bout time," the man grunted, without looking up. Eli squinted. "Len. That you?" The man looked up now. Leonard Briggs, a retired forest tracker in his late 70s, known by everyone around Wild Creek for his peculiar habits and talent for vanishing into the woods for weeks. Leonard was wiry thin, with a perpetually grumpy face and hands knotted like old rope. But beneath the gruffness was an uncanny understanding of the woods, and a surprising fondness for children. "Thought that was your mutt barking," Leonard said, eyes landing on Sophie. "You carrying a ghost, Eli?" "She's real. Got caught in the marsh." Eli gently eased Sophie down onto a dry patch beside the fire. Leonard tossed him a faded wool blanket. "Use that. Fire's yours. I ain't built for comfort." Then he reached into his pack and handed Eli a small thermos. "Still hot." Eli nodded his thanks, unscrewed the top, and brought it to Sophie's lips. She sipped. Then again. A little color returned to her face. Leonard grunted. "Kid's lucky you found her when you did. That marsh don't let go easy." Eli didn't answer. He knew. As the fire crackled, Sophie sat against Eli's shoulder, eyes finally closing into sleep. Ranger curled beside her like a shadow. "You gonna get her back to camp?" Leonard asked. "In the morning," Eli said. "She needs rest." "So do I." Leonard nodded. "Fair. You want me to radio it in?" Eli shook his head. "Already had a visit from Sarah Myers. She's gone to find the parents." Leonard snorted. "Still driving that damn Jeep that sounds like it's coughing gravel?" Eli smiled faintly. The old tracker rose with effort, dusted his knees. "Well, I'll head toward the lakeside. Just in case they're closer than she thinks." He cast one more look at Sophie, then at Eli. "She reminds me of Claire." Eli tensed, the name hitting like a drumbeat in his chest. "I mean," Leonard added softly, "the eyes. That look. Like they're seeing things deeper than we ever will." And with that, the old man disappeared into the trees, silent as a shadow. Eli watched the fire dance, feeling the heat on his face, the weight of Sophie against his side, the steady presence of Ranger by his feet. Something had shifted. He didn't have a word for it. But it felt like the world, for the first time in a long while, had breathed in, not out. The cabin welcomed them back like an old song remembered at just the right moment. Its weathered frame creaked in the night wind, the porch groaned beneath Eli's boots, and somewhere beneath the cedar shingles, a single bat stirred from its roost. Eli carried Sophie gently in his arms, her small body wrapped in the worn flannel blanket Leonard had given them. Her eyes fluttered open once as they crossed the threshold, then closed again, not from fear, but fatigue. She had surrendered, at last, to safety. Inside, the cabin smelled of pine ash and damp wool. Ranger padded in first, making his rounds with methodical calm. The old German shepherd, mostly black with a faded saddle of rust-colored fur across his back, was nearly 10, with silver hairs flecking his muzzle and a slight stiffness to his gait. But his eyes still burned sharp and amber in the firelight, and tonight they held something deeper, a watchfulness that extended beyond duty. He sat near the hearth, his gaze never leaving the child now cradled on Eli's shoulder. Eli laid Sophie on the small cot in the corner, one he hadn't used in years. The bed belonged to Claire once, when she was small and the world still let Eli believe in second chances. The faded quilt was still folded at the foot. He pulled it up now, covering Sophie with care, then paused to brush a leaf from her tangled hair. It left a dark streak of mud across his knuckles. The water on the stove had begun to steam. He poured some into a tin basin, dipped a cloth in it, and knelt beside her. With slow, steady motions, he wiped the grime from her cheeks, her neck, the folds of her ears. She didn't stir. Only when he touched the crown of her head did she flinch, her lips parting slightly. "It's just me," he whispered. "You're all right." Outside, the wind whistled through the trees in low, unsteady sighs. A branch thudded against the roof, followed by the soft patter of pine needles. It was a storm coming, not fierce, but cold. Eli added 2 logs to the fire. The room brightened, shadows leapt up the walls, and Ranger stretched out on the braided rug, content but alert. Eli moved quietly through the small space. The cabin wasn't much: 1 room, a kitchenette, an old writing desk cluttered with maps and pencils, and shelves holding tins, threadbare books, and a scattering of carved wood animals. The walls were lined with faint pencil markings, growth charts from Claire's younger days. One still read, 6 years, tallest girl in the woods, with a shaky arrow pointing upward. He caught his reflection in the cracked mirror above the sink, grizzled, lined, eyes sunken from years of sleep cut short. But there was a softness there too, unfamiliar. He didn't look away. Sophie stirred again. This time, she opened her eyes fully. "Where's the mud?" she asked sleepily. Eli smiled, sitting back down beside her. "Gone. We cleaned it off." "Where's my mom?" His chest tightened. "She's looking for you. A woman named Sarah is going to bring her here soon." Sophie nodded, then turned her face toward Ranger. "Can he stay?" "He's not going anywhere," Eli said. "He's the reason we found you." The girl reached a hand out, resting it on Ranger's back. The dog didn't move, only blinked slowly, as if to say, "Understood." "Do you live here?" she asked. "Yeah." "Alone?" Eli hesitated. "Mostly." "Why?" He looked at her, debating how much a child needed to know. But her eyes were steady, not afraid. He gave her the simplest truth he could manage. "Because someone I loved didn't come back one day. And sometimes, when things hurt that much, people go quiet inside. Like a turtle." He smiled despite himself. "Exactly like a turtle." She thought about this. "But turtles still come out sometimes." "That's true." A few minutes passed in silence, filled only with the crackle of firewood and the occasional rustle as Sophie shifted beneath the quilt. Eli handed her a warm cup of herbal tea, chamomile and wild mint. She sniffed it suspiciously but drank. From outside came a soft crunch of tires over gravel. Ranger's ears perked, and Eli rose, moving to the window. Headlights filtered weakly through the trees. A knock at the door. Eli opened it to find Sarah Myers, still in her uniform jacket, now speckled with pine needles. Her face was drawn from hours of hiking. Behind her, a woman and man clung to each other, barely upright. The woman looked no older than 35, with shoulder-length chestnut hair, mud streaks on her jeans, and the frantic, glazed expression of a mother on the edge. The man beside her had a day's growth of stubble and was limping slightly, his ankle likely twisted during the search. Eli stepped aside. "She's here. She's okay." The mother, Laura Green, rushed in with a cry stuck somewhere between joy and disbelief. She dropped to her knees beside the cot, scooping Sophie into her arms. "Oh my God, baby, oh my God, are you hurt? Where were you? I was so scared." Sophie buried her face in her mother's neck. "The dog saved me." Laura looked up at Eli, then at Ranger. Her lips trembled. "Thank you. I don't know how to, thank you." Her husband, Mark Green, put a hand on Eli's shoulder. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with sunburned skin and hands rough from construction work. His voice was hoarse. "You brought our little girl back. That means everything." Eli didn't speak, just nodded once. Sarah moved to stand by the fireplace, arms crossed loosely. She studied Eli in silence, then smiled, warm but worn. "You did good," she said. "Real good." Later, after the Greens had sat by the fire, fed Sophie a warm bowl of soup from Eli's dwindling pantry, and wrapped her in a dry coat for the ride back, Laura turned to Eli once more. "If there's anything we can do, anything at all." Eli shook his head. "Just take care of her." They left quietly, Sophie waving from the back seat of Sarah's Jeep as it rolled down the dark trail. Eli watched until the taillights vanished behind the trees. Then he went back inside. Ranger was still by the fire, eyes half closed. Eli sat beside him. "You know," he murmured, "you're still a damn good soldier." Ranger wagged his tail once, slow and sure. Eli leaned back against the wall, his breath falling into the rhythm of the cabin's creaks and sighs. Something inside him had shifted, something warm, just enough to feel again. He closed his eyes. Morning light came gently through the cabin's old paned window, filtering in thin strips across the wooden floor like soft fingers nudging the world awake. The fire had burned low overnight, but Ranger's breathing, slow, even, curled like a comma at the foot of the cot, had kept the silence warm. Outside, the pine trees swayed to the hush of early wind, and somewhere far off, a loon cried over the misted lake. Eli stirred first. His joints groaned with protest as he swung his legs over the edge of the bed, muscles sore from the strain of the night before. But there was something different in the way the morning greeted him. Not brighter, just less empty. He walked quietly over to where Sophie still lay curled beneath the quilt, one arm tucked beneath her cheek, the other resting gently on Ranger's back. She looked different in sleep, unguarded, a little sunburned on the nose, with dried mud still faintly crusted near her ear. But her face was peaceful now, no longer pinched by fear. Eli didn't wake her. He stepped outside instead. The air was cool, tinged with the scent of earth and spruce. A few crows flitted between branches, cawing about nothing in particular. He walked down the short path to the edge of the clearing, where the trail split toward the lake. He needed to gather kindling, maybe check the traps, his hands wanted work. Ranger didn't follow him this time. Instead, the old dog had lifted his head the moment the door closed, nose twitching. Something had stirred in his memory, something unfinished. He rose, shook out his stiff legs, and padded toward the back door. There, beneath a bramble of scrub brush and damp leaves, lay a flash of color that didn't belong, red, frayed at the edges. It was the scarf. The same scarf Sophie had been wearing when she wandered into the woods. She'd dropped it somewhere in the chaos near the bog, and somehow, Ranger had remembered. He nosed it carefully, then picked it up between his teeth and trotted back into the cabin. When Sophie opened her eyes, the first thing she saw was Ranger, standing still beside the cot, holding something in his mouth. The red scarf dangled like a banner of yesterday, torn but intact. Her eyes widened. She sat up slowly, reached for it, and Ranger let go without hesitation. She clutched the scarf to her chest, then looked into the dog's eyes for a long moment. "Thank you," she whispered. Eli came back in to find her awake and upright, hair tousled, cheeks flushed with sleep. He froze when he saw her, because she was smiling. Not wide. Not loud. But it was there. He crouched beside her. "You feeling okay?" She nodded. "Hungry?" Another nod. He poured her a bowl of oatmeal, added a few blueberries from the tin on the shelf, and handed her a wooden spoon. She ate slowly, chewing each bite with care, the scarf still looped around her neck like a talisman. When she finished, she slid off the cot and walked over to her backpack, which Sarah had returned to her the night before. From it, she pulled a small sketchbook and a pencil case. She sat cross-legged on the rug and began to draw, head tilted, tongue peeking slightly from the corner of her mouth. Eli didn't interrupt. He busied himself by cleaning up, washing dishes in the enamel basin, refolding blankets. But he kept glancing over his shoulder. When she was done, she stood and walked over to him, holding the page out with both hands. It was a child's drawing, uneven and simple, but the meaning hit Eli like thunder. On the page was a muddy field, and from it rose a heart, big, bright, half-buried but pulsing. Beside it stood a tall man with gray hair and a beard, wearing a flannel shirt, one hand reaching out. And beside him, a German shepherd, tail raised, head lifted like a banner. Sophie had written above it in uneven block letters, "Thank you." He stared at the page, unable to speak. "She's an artist," came a voice behind him. Eli turned. Laura Green was standing in the doorway, her jeans still dusty, a windbreaker zipped halfway. Her eyes were tired but gentle. "I hope it's okay we came by," she added. "She didn't stop talking about you two all night. Especially your dog." Eli nodded, stepping aside. "Of course." Laura knelt beside Sophie. "You okay, sweetheart?" Sophie nodded, then held up the drawing. "I want to leave it." Eli blinked. "You don't have to." "I want to," she said. Laura looked up at him, smiling. "She's a quiet one, but she means what she says." Mark Green followed her in, carrying a thermos and a bag of pastries. "Peace offering," he said, grinning. "For rescuing our whole world." He was taller than Eli remembered, with warm eyes and grease-stained fingers that spoke of working hands. He set the bag down on the counter and extended a hand. "Mark." "Eli." They shook once, firm, quiet. For the next hour, the cabin filled with a kind of life Eli hadn't felt in years. Sophie sat with Ranger, feeding him small pieces of muffin. Laura chatted with Eli about the woods, the lake, her job as a part-time librarian. Mark offered to help fix the loose porch step next time they visited. No one rushed. No one looked at their phones. No one asked Eli why he lived out here alone. Before they left, Sophie placed the folded drawing on the mantel above the fireplace. She looked up at Eli and said, "So you don't forget." Eli knelt to meet her gaze. "I won't." Then, with one last hug for Ranger, she followed her parents out the door. Ranger watched them go, his tail wagging once before he returned to the hearth. Eli stood in the center of the room for a long time, the folded page in his hands. The heart, the mud, the dog, the man, it was more than a thank you. It was a memory, a bridge, maybe even a beginning. And for the first time in a decade, Eli let it in. The next morning, the cabin seemed to hold its breath, as if sensing something about to change. A cool mist had crept in overnight, curling around the pine trunks like forgotten smoke, and the lake, just beyond the trees, was a perfect mirror, still, silent, waiting. Inside, Eli sat at the table with his mug of coffee going cold in his hands. His eyes weren't on the fire or the woods or even Ranger, who dozed near the door. They were on Sophie. She sat by the window, legs dangling from the bench, still wearing the red scarf around her neck. Her eyes traced the landscape outside, but her fingers were busy, folding the edge of the drawing she'd made the day before, creasing it carefully, as if the act of folding could keep it alive a little longer. She's not just quiet, Eli thought. She's watching, always watching. There was a new weight to the air, something unfinished between them. As much as the warmth of their shared days had soothed him, Eli knew what he had to do. The world outside the cabin hadn't disappeared. Somewhere out there, her people were still looking. He cleared his throat. "Sophie." She turned. "I think we should head back to where you were camping. See if anyone's still there." For a moment, she didn't move. Then she nodded, just once, and got up, pulling on the jacket Laura had left for her. It was too big, but she didn't seem to mind. Eli packed a small canvas bag with water, sandwiches, and a first aid kit. He strapped it to his back while Sophie laced her boots in quiet determination. Ranger, sensing the shift, stood and stretched, tail swishing low. Before they left, Sophie glanced once more at the drawing on the mantel, then tucked a small folded paper into the inner pocket of her jacket. She didn't say why. The woods that morning were hushed but golden, dappled with sunlight filtering through tall firs and cottonwoods. As they made their way toward the direction Eli remembered, the path that skirted the bog and wound east toward the campsites, he kept glancing back at Sophie, checking her pace, her expression. She walked with a purpose, neither too fast nor slow, but he noticed how tightly she clutched Ranger's fur when the trail narrowed or the ground turned slick with leaves. They walked for almost 45 minutes before the trail widened and the faint smell of burned wood and marshmallow ash wafted on the breeze. Eli slowed. "We're close," he said. Ranger stopped, ears rising sharply. Then came a sound, faint, cracked, but human. "Sophie." It was a woman's voice, carried on the wind like a lifeline. Sophie froze. "Sophie." Another call, closer now. Her lips parted, her eyes wide. "That's her," she whispered. It was the first time Eli had heard her voice in full, and it startled him, not by volume but by the soft tremble in it, the fragility holding back weeks of buried fear. She didn't wait. She ran. "Sophie." The figure that emerged from the trees was Laura, hair disheveled, face scraped by branches, coat half unzipped, and boots splattered with clay. Her eyes were wild, and her chest rose and fell in uneven gasps. But when she saw the red scarf and the little girl beneath it, her entire body broke open. Sophie threw herself forward, and mother and child collided in an embrace that felt like the forest itself leaned in to witness. Laura held her, sobbing without restraint. "Oh my God. Sophie. I thought. Sophie, for the first time since she disappeared, cried openly. But they were not frightened tears anymore. They were release. She said nothing, just held on. Eli stood a few paces away, hands in his coat pockets, watching. From behind Laura, two men appeared, one of them tall and lean, the other stocky with a buzz cut and a notepad in hand. The tall one wore a sheriff's badge. Deputy Aaron Wells, late 30s, carried a calm presence that spoke of long hours in the field. His uniform was worn at the seams, and a fading scar across his jawline suggested a past not untouched by violence. He nodded once to Eli. "You the one found her?" Eli nodded. "Name?" "Eli Morgan." The deputy scribbled it down, then looked to Ranger. "That your dog? He's the one that really found her." Aaron's lips curled faintly. "Well, give him a stake on us." The other man, Rudy Quinn, a young park ranger barely older than a college student, snapped a photo with his phone. "We've had half the county out here looking," he said, awed. "And she ends up with you." "She ended up with him," Eli said, nodding at Ranger. Soon, more voices arrived, Sarah among them, breathless, her sharp blue eyes scanning the scene. Tall and wiry in her early 50s, Sarah Hall moved like someone who had long ago learned to survive on caffeine and instinct. Her sharp features often made people mistake her for stern, but those who knew her understood her heart was built like a lighthouse, always watching, always warning. When she reached Eli, she didn't speak immediately. She simply looked from Sophie to Ranger, then to Eli, and back. "You brought her home," she said softly. "I just followed the dog." Sarah smirked, then turned to the other officers. "Let's give them some space. Mom needs time." As the others drifted off to call in updates, Eli stood awkwardly to the side. Laura, still on the ground, looked up at him through a blur of tears. "You walked her back," she said. "I wasn't sure anyone would still be here." "I told them you would be," Sophie added quietly, still holding her mother's sleeve. Mark arrived minutes later, breathless and muddy, and scooped Sophie into his arms, spinning her gently once in disbelief. "I'll never let you go again," he whispered, over and over. And then, as the officers escorted the reunited family back toward the trailhead, Sophie broke free for a moment and ran back to Eli. She reached into her coat pocket and unfolded the paper she had hidden that morning. It was another drawing, this one of the woods, a trail, and a small cabin with smoke rising gently from the chimney. On the porch, two figures, an old man with a beard and a dog at his feet. She pressed it into Eli's hand. "You can keep this one," she said. He looked at it for a long time. "Thank you," he said, his voice low. "I'll hang it next to the first." Then, with a final squeeze of Ranger's neck, she turned and ran to catch up with her family. Eli stood in the clearing, the paper fluttering slightly in his hand. Ranger sat beside him, tail brushing the dirt, head tilted up toward the sky as if sensing that something, not just a girl, had been returned today. The forest seemed to hush itself as they moved forward, like the world was holding its breath for a moment too sacred to disturb. The wind had slowed, brushing softly against the canopy above, and warm beams of amber sun filtered through the branches, stretching long golden arms across the undergrowth. Eli led the way with steady steps, Ranger close to his heel, and Sophie nestled between her parents, her small hands gripping both of theirs like she feared they might disappear if she let go. Laura's face, though streaked with dried tears and exhaustion, had begun to soften. There was a new light in her eyes now, not just relief, but awe. Her daughter was safe. Dirt smudged, clothes rumpled, but alive. Beside her, Mark Green, Sophie's father, looked a decade older than his actual age of 41. Tall and lean with dark hair prematurely graying at the temples, he had a worn, drawn look that only sleeplessness and despair could chisel into a man's features. Normally even-tempered and gentle, Mark had unraveled in Sophie's absence, pacing through the nights, scouring the woods with nothing but a flashlight and prayer. They passed through a dense patch of pines, the trunks close enough to feel like bars, and finally emerged into a small, open glade marked by the familiar boulder near their old campsite. And there, just as Sophie had remembered it, was the spot where they'd last seen her. Her parents halted, silent. Laura's knees gave way first. She dropped beside the boulder, palm pressing against its cold surface, her shoulders trembling as the memory of that moment washed back, Sophie slipping from sight, her call drowned by the rustling trees, the sudden, aching silence that followed. Mark didn't speak either. He circled slowly, eyes scanning the place like it still might offer clues, some answer to how they'd ever lost her. Sophie stepped forward then, her small boots crunching softly over fallen needles. She didn't speak, only moved to her mother's side and knelt beside her. She didn't need to say a word. Laura turned and folded her daughter into her arms, and all of the grief that had been caught in her chest since that terrible hour poured out in soundless sobs. Sophie clung tightly, burying her face into her mother's coat. Mark moved slowly, almost reverently, toward them. His hands hovered for a moment before finding Sophie's back. "Ba day," he whispered, voice catching. "Ba o day, con guy." The simple sentence shattered whatever wall remained in him, and he dropped to his knees, pressing his forehead to hers, tears trailing silently down his face. Eli stood at the edge of the clearing, hands in his pockets, his eyes quietly taking in the scene. He made no move to approach, but Ranger did. The old dog trotted over to the family and, without hesitation, sat beside them, still and strong. His body, with its thick black and tan coat and broad, calm chest, settled like an anchor between them. A protector. A witness. Mark looked up at the dog, then at Eli. "He didn't leave her, did he?" Eli shook his head. "Not for a second. I owe him everything." "You owe him a steak," Eli said dryly, but the corners of his mouth lifted slightly. Laura chuckled softly through her tears. "He's getting a whole roast if he wants one." Sophie leaned into Ranger then, one arm still wrapped around her mother. She placed her forehead against his and whispered something no one else could hear. The dog's tail brushed the earth once in reply. From the woods behind them, Sarah emerged, drawn by instinct, perhaps, or by her tireless commitment. Her face was set in its usual firm lines, but as she took in the image before her, the family reuniting, Ranger in the center, Eli just beyond, her shoulders dropped. She didn't speak at first, just gave a small nod. Then another figure stepped up beside her, Deputy Aaron Wells, still scribbling notes but now moving slower, quieter. "Guess this is the part where we let them be," he murmured to Sarah. Sarah nodded. "Let them breathe." The sun continued its slow descent behind the trees. Golden turned to orange, and the light scattered like spilled ink across the forest floor. Sophie, now cradled between both parents, looked up at Eli. "Will you come with us?" Eli hesitated. "This is your family's moment." "But you're part of it now," she said gently. Mark rose to his feet, brushing dirt from his jeans. "Sir. I don't know what to say. Thank you doesn't even feel close." "You don't have to say anything," Eli said. "Just, take her home. And hold her tighter than you ever did before." Laura stood as well, offering her hand. "You saved her. And you gave us back a piece of our hearts we thought was gone. I don't think we'll ever forget you." Eli hesitated, then reached forward and took her hand. "She did most of the saving herself," he said. Sarah finally stepped forward. "We've arranged transport back to the lodge. I told the paramedics to wait. No sirens. No drama." Laura nodded. "Thank you." Ranger trotted back to Eli and nudged his legs softly. Eli reached down and stroked the dog's head. "You ready?" he whispered. Ranger looked up, eyes soft, then glanced back at Sophie, as if asking for permission to leave. Sophie stepped forward and knelt. She wrapped her arms around Ranger's neck again, this time holding on just a bit longer. "You're my best friend," she whispered. "You listened when nobody else could hear me." Ranger licked her cheek gently, and she giggled through her drying tears. Sarah clapped her hands once. "All right, let's bring this girl home." As the group began to walk back down the trail, the sun dipped below the tree line, casting the glade in gentle twilight. The silence returned, but it was no longer heavy with dread. It was filled instead with something softer. Something whole. And when they looked back one last time, Eli and Ranger stood at the edge of the woods, not following, just watching. Not needing to belong to the moment, only to honor it. The late autumn air carried the kind of chill that slipped in through the seams of even the tightest doorframes. Outside Eli's cabin, the lake lay still as polished glass, reflecting the burnished colors of the fading leaves. The geese had long flown south, and the woods around Wild Creek had gone quiet again, blanketed in golden silence. Eli Morgan sat in his usual chair by the fireplace, the one worn smooth by a decade of solitude, its leather softened by time and grief. He had just finished his morning coffee when Ranger, now lying by the hearth with his front paws neatly crossed, lifted his head and gave a single bark, low and deliberate. A second later, there was a knock at the door. Eli rose slowly. His knees weren't what they used to be, though he'd never admit it aloud. As he opened the door, the breeze caught the scent of pine, smoke, and something faintly sweet, like cinnamon. A young postal worker stood outside, bundled in layers, cheeks red from the cold. "Morning, sir," he said cheerfully. "I've got something special for you today." He handed Eli a small brown envelope, the kind that held no bills or warnings. Just a name written in a child's uneven script, to Mr. Eli and Ranger. No return address. Just that. "Came through the main office with priority markings," the boy added. "Thought I'd bring it by myself." It looked important. Eli gave a curt nod. "Thanks." As the boy turned and trudged back toward the road, Eli closed the door and held the envelope for a long moment before opening it. Ranger watched him with quiet eyes, tail thumping once against the floor as if sensing what it meant. Inside, nestled between two folds of soft, crinkled paper, was a handmade card, constructed with construction paper and taped corners. The front showed a drawing in bold crayon, a tall man with a gray beard, a big brown and black dog, a small girl with messy hair, and two smiling parents. They were all holding hands under a bright sun. The sky was filled with little stars, even though it was daytime. Ranger had been drawn twice the size of everyone else, his tongue out, tail mid-wag. Inside the card, in a careful scrawl, were the words. "Thank you for listening to the world when no one else did. I hope Ranger still remembers me. Love, Sophie." Eli's hand paused halfway through reading. The words blurred. Not because the ink had run, because his eyes had. He leaned back against the thick wooden door behind him, letting it support the weight of memory and something tender blooming beneath his ribs. He pressed the card gently to his chest and closed his eyes. "I think she's all right now," he murmured. Ranger let out a soft, barely audible huff and came to sit beside him. The dog leaned into Eli's leg, pressing warm fur against old denim. Eli reached down and scratched behind the ears he'd come to trust more than most people. "She didn't forget us," he said. "And we won't forget her." That night, Eli pulled down an old wooden box from the top shelf of his cupboard. Inside were relics, photographs of his daughter before the flood, letters from another life, medals tucked into soft cloth. He added the card to it, laying it carefully on top like a seal. The fire crackled low in the hearth as the evening dimmed into dusk. Ranger curled up close to the hearth once more, but this time, Eli joined him on the rug. He wasn't a man for dramatics, but he found himself speaking aloud to no one in particular. "She brought the light back, didn't she, boy?" Ranger shifted, resting his chin on Eli's knee. The man chuckled softly and whispered, Yeah, I know. You did most of the work." In the weeks that followed, Eli began to walk the trails again, not out of duty, but out of want. He would nod to passing hikers with a gentler expression than they'd expect from a man who looked so gruff. He even stopped by the ranger station once to drop off some fresh firewood and found himself staying for coffee with Sarah. Sarah, tall and lean with her dark braid now streaked with silver, had always been a woman of quiet fire. She'd spent most of her adult life moving from post to post, never staying too long, never letting anyone get too close. But after seeing what Eli and Ranger had done, after watching a girl walk out of a forest alive, she'd begun to believe that healing didn't have to come in big declarations. Sometimes it came in crayon drawings. Sometimes in silence. "You thinking of visiting town again?" she asked Eli one afternoon, passing him a chipped mug. "Maybe," he answered, "if the hardware store still sells real nails instead of those soft things." She smirked. "You say that every year." And maybe this time, he meant it. Meanwhile, Mark and Laura Green wrote a letter too, one that came a week after Sophie's card. It was more formal, composed in Mark's neat script, expressing their eternal gratitude, offering an open invitation to visit anytime. "She talks about you both every day," it read. "She's drawing more now than ever. And she's talking again, Eli. Really talking." Enclosed was a small photo, Sophie standing in their backyard, arms outstretched in a red scarf, Ranger's old collar around a stuffed dog's neck. Her smile reached the corners of her eyes. Eli placed the photo on the mantel. There was one last moment that winter, small, maybe even insignificant to someone else, but it mattered. One late evening, snow lightly falling, Eli stood outside his cabin with Ranger by his side. He looked out across the lake, now beginning to freeze along the edges. With a quiet breath, he said the name he hadn't said aloud in a decade. Lily. He didn't cry. He didn't collapse. He just spoke her name into the frost-bitten air, and for the first time, it didn't feel like a wound reopening. He turned and walked back inside, Ranger at his side. They were no longer just two old shadows living beside a lake. They were a story now, a quiet, steady one, written in mud, in warmth, in rescue, and in a little girl's crayon drawing of hands held beneath a sun that never stopped shining. Sometimes, miracles don't come with thunder or light, they arrive quietly, through the muddy paws of a loyal dog, or the worn hands of a man who thought his story had ended. Perhaps it was no accident that Ranger heard what no one else did. Perhaps, in the silence of that forest, God was still speaking, through love, through instinct, through grace. And maybe, just maybe, we're all someone's second chance waiting to happen. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who needs a little hope today. Leave a comment below, what part stayed with you most? And if you believe in the quiet miracles God still works through people and animals, type Amen in the comments. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and may God bless you and those you love, wherever you are tonight.